The United States didn't always use prison as the default punishment for breaking the law. Early in the United States history, punishment was largely public and designed to shame the criminal. Most people are familiar with images of the stocks or pillories and public whippings, things like that. At that time, jails were mostly just used for people who are waiting for trial or waiting for their punishment. Incarceration was rarely used as a punishment just by itself. In the early 1800s, people started pushing for reform because they felt like the old methods of punishment were not effective. Corporal punishments were replaced with systems of hard labor. In the 1820s, the United States saw its first penitentiaries. The name comes from the word penitence because people thought that people had to pay penance for their crimes, which were sins. The United States population was growing very rapidly at this time, and so people wanted to rid themselves of deviants. The asylum and the almshouse also rose in popularity at this time to incarcerate the mentally ill and the poor. Of course, at this time, people had a very bad idea of what mentally ill meant and how to treat people who had mental illnesses. All of these institutions had notoriously bad conditions and treated people very poorly. After the Civil War, the newly freed slaves saw many laws put into place to control them. These so-called black codes were the precursors to the later Jim Crow laws. Some of these laws were so severe and so broad that almost any behavior could be deemed criminal. One Louisiana town even banned all black people from entering without written permission, and if they wanted to walk around at night, they had to be accompanied by a white person. Other examples of black codes include banning impudence, rude or insulting gestures, cursing, or even disobedience. Also at this time, 9 southern states created vagrancy laws that basically criminalized being poor or unemployed. The vagrancy laws were not technically part of the black codes, but they were so selectively applied to blacks that they might as well have been. If a black man didn't have proof of employment, he could be arrested. So between the black codes, the asylum, and the almshouse, you could be arrested for just about anything, whether it's just because you're black, you're poor, or just you seem a little bit off. Around this time, many southern states realized that they could lease out their convicts to businessmen or to private corporations. These states' economies were in shambles after the Civil War, and they needed a way to generate revenue. Renting out convicts was an easy way to raise some money while also providing cheap labor to businesses. The convicts had to work for little or no pay, and they were forced to work in very difficult, dangerous conditions. In 1872, 25% of all black convicts that were leased out died. Leased convicts were also used to break strikes in the South. In 1891, miners in Tennessee refused to sign a contract that required that they pledge not to strike, required that they be paid in vouchers or tokens, and they had to give up the right to weigh the coal that they mined, and they were paid by weight. When the miners refused to sign the contract, they were evicted from their homes, which were company-owned houses, and convicts were brought in. The convict lease scheme proved to be extremely lucrative. In 1883, Alabama received just 10% of its revenue from convict leases. By 1898, however, almost 73% of the state's revenue came from convict leases. Eventually, convict leases became chain gangs, but by the end of the 19th century, public outrage over prison conditions led to a brief reformatory period, which attempted to provide education, work, and counseling. Variable sentences, 4 to 7 years, were also introduced because it was thought that some prisoners could reform faster than others and should then be released. In the 20th century, hard labor fell out of favor as the primary form of punishment, and just being in prison became the punishment. As the Jim Crow era came to a close and the civil rights movement peaked, politicians moved away from campaigning on segregation and started just talking about law and order. President Nixon campaigned heavily under the law and order slogan, and he promised to crack down on crime. Nixon also declared drugs to be public enemy #1 and began the war on drugs. Later, President Reagan also promised to crack down on crime. He also condemned welfare queens and the criminal predators. All of this led to a very fast rise in the number of prisons and prisoners. California is one of the worst examples of this. California opened its first prison in 1852. In over 100 years after that, California opened just 9 more prisons. Everything changed in the 1980s, though. From 1984 to 1989, California doubled the number of prisons that it had. And in the 1990s, California opened 12 more prisons. In just 15 years, California went from 9 prisons to over 30. This trend happened across the United States. In 1980, the US had less than 500,000 people incarcerated. We now have over 2.5 million people behind bars.